All right, welcome back to Vuln Vibes. Back again for your WP Safe block.
Daily dose of WordPress vulnerabilities coming right up.
You got it, and you know our listeners, our security pros, they already live and breathe this stuff right. MITRE, ATT&CK framework, kill chains, they know it all. So, no need to rehash the basics. Let's just dive into the trends.
Straight to the good stuff.
Exactly. We got a whole bunch of new vulnerabilities, plugins, themes, you name it. So let's pick out the pattern, see what's really putting our security at risk.
Sounds good. Let's take a look at what's been popping up this week. Privilege escalation, unauthorized data changes, local file inclusion, PHP, object injection, all that fun stuff.
So much fun. And I think a good place to start is privilege escalation through account takeover. Two examples really jumped out at me. First one, Service Finder Bookings plugin, versions up to 5.0. It's messing up the user identity validation, like during those auto logins after booking or when you upload a profile, even changing passwords.
Yeah, that's a straight shot to admin control right there. An attacker doesn't even need to be logged in. They just need to know a user's email, and boom, they can basically log in as them. And if they can change any user's password, including the admin's, well, game over. Your access controls are meaningless at that point.
Yeah, no kidding. It's like handing them the keys to the kingdom. And then we got the Boombox Theme Extensions plugin up to 1.8.0. Same story, different vulnerability. It's in the Boombox Ajax reset password function. This time, it is about identity validation again, but this one actually needs an authenticated user.
Right, but here's the thing. It doesn't even have to be a high-level account. Even a subscriber can use this to reset anyone's password, admins included. So you might think you're safe because it's just a low-level account that's been compromised, but this flaw completely changes the game. Shows how important it is to have solid security for all user roles, not just the admins.
Makes you realize how a seemingly minor compromise can escalate quickly. So stepping back a bit, what's the common thread we are seeing with all these identity validation issues?
Honestly, I think developers are making too many assumptions. They're not verifying things at each step. They're kind of just trusting that the request is legit. That leaves the door wide open for attackers to sneak in, pretend to be someone else, or mess with credentials. It's a basic security principle, but we see it overlooked all the time. And the consequences, they can be huge.
All right, so moving on. We got another way folks are getting escalated privileges, and that's by messing with data directly. The Altair theme, versions up to 5.2.4, is a perfect example. It's missing a capability check in the functions.php file.
Ah, yes. And that means anyone, even if they aren't logged in, can change WordPress options. Think about it. If they can change the default user role to admin and then turn on user registration, they can create as many admin accounts as they want.
It's not like they are hacking into the code directly or anything. They're just exploiting how WordPress is set up, just because of one little missing check.
Exactly. That's what makes these so sneaky. They are abusing legitimate features.
Yeah.
And that's what we really need to watch out for. Those subtle access control oversights that can lead to someone getting a foothold, and that can turn into a full-blown compromise.
Now we also got Cozy Stay theme up to version 1.7.0, similar problem, missing a capability check on the Ajax handler function. We don't know exactly what actions they can trigger, but, the lack of authorization alone is a red flag, right?
Absolutely. It means anyone, even without logging in, could be poking around in the application, doing who knows what, could be corrupting data, crashing the site, maybe even finding another way to escalate privileges. It really highlights how important it is to lock down every single public function, make sure you are checking who's allowed to do what, no exceptions.
So bottom line with these capability check oversights.
Well, you got to have proper authorization. You can't just let anyone waltz in and do whatever they want. Otherwise, you're just inviting attackers to bypass your security, change data they shouldn't be touching, and potentially even grab some long-term access. It really reinforces how crucial it is for developers to stick to the principle of least privilege, only give access to what's absolutely necessary, and double-check, triple-check those capability checks for any operation that could be sensitive.
No shortcuts on security. And speaking of not letting just anyone do whatever they want, let's talk about what happens when authenticated attackers get in, even if it's just a low-level account. The food bakery theme, that delivery restaurant directory one, up to version 4.7, this one's a bit of a doozy. It's got capability checks missing all over the place, tons of functions affected.
Yeah, this one is a bit worrying. You've got functions for deleting backups, messing with widgets, saving theme options, you name it. And they're all open to anyone with a subscriber account. That means if someone manages to compromise even a basic account, they can wreak havoc. We are talking about serious data loss. Maybe the site gets defaced, services could be disrupted, all because a low-level account got breached.
Right, so it's not just about keeping the bad guys out completely, it's about controlling what they can do once they are, even if it's just a little bit in.
Absolutely. You need granular control. You got to manage what each user role can access.
Hmm.
If you don't, even those little admin tasks can become huge vulnerabilities if the wrong person gets their hands on them. And this theme, it's a textbook example of how a lack of authorization can have a massive impact.
All right, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about local file inclusion, or LFI for short. Minimog WP, that e-commerce theme up to version 3.7.0, has a vulnerability in the template parameter. And anyone can exploit this. They don't even need to be logged in. Why is LFI such a headache, even after all these years?
Because it's a direct line to the server's files. With this one, anyone can access and potentially run any file on the server. And with Minimize WP, you can upload files, right?
Yeah.
So imagine an attacker uploads some sneaky code disguised as, I don't know, an image or something. Then they use this LFI vulnerability to execute it. Boom, they got control. And all because the input wasn't properly sanitized. It's a classic attack, but it still works because developers miss these things.
Right, so even though it's an old trick, it's still very effective. Now, we also got S2 Member Pro up to version 250212, another LFI. This time it's in the template attribute, but for this one, you do need to be logged in at least contributor level or higher. So does that make it less of a problem, since it needs authentication?
It does make it a bit harder, but the damage potential is still there. If an attacker compromises an account with the right privileges, they can still use this LFI to snoop around for sensitive data, maybe bypass some other security measures, and depending on the setup, they might even be able to run their own code. It shows that even when you have authentication, you still need to be careful about what files users can access. You can't just let them include anything they want.
So what are some of the common mistakes that lead to these LFI vulnerabilities?
A lot of times it comes down to not cleaning up the input from the user. When you're building file paths, you got to make sure you are sanitizing and validating that input. Developers might think, oh, this parameter will only have certain values, but without the right checks in place, an attacker can sneak in some directory traversal or include files they shouldn't be touching. It's a lesson in secure coding, especially when you're messing with the file system.
Speaking of messing with things, we've got PHP object injection popping up in both Cozy Stay up to 1.7.0 and Tiny Salt up to 3.9.0. Both of these plugins are using insecure deserialization in their AJAX handler functions. Now, from what I understand, neither of these plugins have a POP chain that can be exploited right now, so no immediate danger. But from a security standpoint, what should our listeners be thinking about here?
The big concern is that it's a ticking time bomb. Sure, those specific plugins might be safe for now, but this insecure deserialization, it means they're vulnerable. What happens if someone installs another plugin or even a theme that does have a POP chain? Suddenly, that seemingly harmless vulnerability becomes a backdoor. An attacker could use it to inject something malicious, and then, boom, it triggers code execution through that other plugin. It's a perfect example of how the whole WordPress ecosystem is connected and how a vulnerability in one place can make everything else more risky.
It's a great point. You can't just look at things in isolation. You got to think about the whole system, how all the pieces fit together.
Exactly. You might think you're safe because you've checked one plugin, but if you don't look at the whole picture, you could miss something critical. And that's why thorough security audits are so important. You got to consider all the different plugins and themes, see how they interact.
All right, so moving right along, let's talk about cross-site request forgery, CSRF. Remember Food Bakery, that theme we talked about earlier? Well, it's back, still version 4.7, and still vulnerable, this time, to CSRF. And guess what? It's those same functions with the missing capability checks. So how does CSRF work in this case?
Well, since those functions don't validate nonces properly, an attacker can create these sneaky requests that get executed if a logged-in admin clicks the wrong link or visits a bad website. Their browser basically does the attacker's bidding on the WordPress site. So an attacker could delete files, change theme options, all sorts of stuff. It's like they're hijacking the admin session without the admin ever realizing it.
Tricky, so it's all about exploiting the trust between the website and the user's browser.
Yeah, exactly. CSRF attacks are all about forging those requests, bypassing the normal interface. And if the application isn't checking where the request is coming from, which is what nonces are for, then it's game over.
All right, last but not least, let's talk about arbitrary file uploads. The FileAway plugin, up to version 3.9.9.0.1, has a problem in its upload function. So if an attacker exploits this, what's the worst that could happen right away?
Well, arbitrary file uploads are dangerous because they let attackers put whatever they want, like malicious code, directly onto the server. And in this case, there are no capability checks and no real file type validation. So an attacker could just upload a PHP web shell, bypass everything, and instantly have control of the server. It's a huge security flaw, one of the most serious ones you can find.
Wow. All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here. For our audience, all the security pros out there, what are the big trends that stand out to you this week?
It all comes back to the basics, honestly. We're still seeing failures in input validation, authorization checks are missing, and developers are handling files and serialization in insecure ways. And what's even more concerning is that so many of these vulnerabilities lead straight to privilege escalation or remote code execution. That's not a small problem, that's a huge problem. It tells me we need to be doing more, better security audits, more training for developers on secure coding practices. And when it comes to WordPress deployments, we need a multi-layered defense.
So, given all that, what should our listeners be doing right now to protect themselves?
The first thing is to check their WordPress installations, make sure they aren't running any of these vulnerable plugins or themes, and if they are, update them, like yesterday. But beyond that, this is a wake-up call. They need to review their security posture, make sure they have strong password policies, use the principle of least privilege for user roles, and seriously consider a web application firewall. That extra layer of protection can make a big difference.
All right. Great advice. So, to wrap things up, what's the one big question everyone should be asking themselves after seeing all these WordPress vulnerabilities?
I think it's this. In this day and age, with attackers getting more sophisticated all the time, why are we still seeing these basic security mistakes over and over again? How can we change things both within our own organizations and in the WordPress community as a whole to start building security in from the ground up? That's the real challenge, and it's one we need to address.
Food for thought. I like it. All right, folks, that's our deep dive for today. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.